Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for this episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. I'm Pastor Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Don't forget, as always, like the video, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel, you know the drill. Today's question, dear Pastor, I'm looking into Lutheranism and am particularly interested in the Scandinavian tradition. It seems that compared with the German variety, it had retained the historic episcopate and put a high emphasis on a higher liturgy. Could you please explain why this came to be and the history of how Lutheranism came to the Nordic countries? All right, so at the time of the Reformation, the political situation in the Scandinavian countries was unstable. Since 1397, the Union of Kalmar, the kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway had all been politically united under one king. And from 1513 to 1523, the Danish king, Christian II, ruled this union. And he attempted to bring the Reformation to Denmark, but he was met with stiff opposition from the Danish clergy and nobility. Christian II, he was most concerned with curtailing the power of Roman bishops and keeping church money there in Denmark, and rather than having it go off to Rome. At the time, Sweden was resisting Danish rule, and Christian ended up losing his crown because he murdered the resistance leaders in an incident that historians call the Stockholm bloodbath. He fled to Wittenberg, where he took refuge there and was present there for quite some time. He was even in Augsburg when the Augsburg Confession was presented in 1530. Anyway, so Christian II leaves, and the Danish nobles elect Frederick I to succeed Christian. Frederick ruled from 1523 to 1533, and it was during his time that Sweden freed itself from Danish control with the leadership of Gustav Vasa, who we'll come back to in just a moment. So Frederick was a Lutheran, yet he promised the conservative nobility of Denmark that he wasn't going to move against the old religion. In his own duchies, he allowed evangelical preaching. He appointed a man named Hans Tausen as his court chaplain. Tausen had been a student of Luther's in Wittenberg. Frederick also obtained toleration for Lutherans at the 1527 Diet. And in 1529, Christian Petersen published a Danish translation of the New Testament. After Frederick died in 1533, the bishops tried to suppress the Reformation in Denmark. They banned Townsend from preaching, and they caused a small civil war in which Christian III was victorious. After his victory, the bishops were imprisoned and replaced with evangelical superintendents. So Christian III, who ruled from 1533 to 1559, he introduced an evangelical church order written by Johannes Bugenhagen, Luther's colleague and pastor. During this time, bishops became superintendents, and the king became the head of the Danish church as the chief bishop. The Augsburg Confession was accepted as the official creedal statement of the Danish kingdom, which also included Norway and Iceland at the time. Now, that's Denmark. Turning to Sweden, this takes us back to Gustav Vasa, who I mentioned just a few moments ago. After leading a successful independence movement beginning in 1521, he was crowned king of Sweden in 1523. That effectively ended the Union of Kalmar. 4 years later, in 1527, he forced the church to hand over its lands to the crown, and the chief proponents then in the Reformation in Sweden, there were two brothers, Olavus and Laurentius Petri. The Petri brothers, they were both educated at Wittenberg under Luther. Olavus produced a Swedish New Testament in 1526 and a Swedish Mass that was influenced by Luther's Latin Mass, the Formula Missae. But there were distinctive differences. Olavus' younger brother, Laurentius, he was consecrated Archbishop of Uppsala in 1531, an office which he would go on to hold for 42 years. Laurentius Petri's biggest contribution then to the Swedish Reformation was his 1571 church order. And since Finland was a territory of Sweden, then Finland followed suit. So that's just a really brief historical sketch of how the Reformation came to the Scandinavian countries. The history of the Reformation in Germany and Scandinavia, especially Sweden. This helps us understand, I think, why, in spite of all the similarities, the episcopacy was retained in Sweden and not in Germany. So for Sweden, the Reformation was a national movement. Most of the bishops supported the Reformation, and this allowed for a continuation of the episcopacy. The Swedes even claim apostolic succession, although, of course, Rome doesn't recognize that without fellowship with the papal see of Rome. Anyway, the intentional perpetuation of the episcopacy, that provided organizational stability. It also provided for the retention of church uses like vestments, candles, and other ceremonial. And so the Swedish bishops then also exerted their independence over against the king when it became necessary. So it was a much more of a monolithic Reformation, Sweden's was, than Germany's was. Now, that being said, we shouldn't romanticize the Swedish episcopacy. In spite of Gustav's intentional continuation of the episcopate, it really wasn't an important part of the church's life in Sweden. Gustav stopped appointing bishops after 1540, and instead he appointed ordinarii, which had the king's authority to supervise clergy and ordain new priests. In 1554, he did allow the appointment of two bishops in Finland, Michael Agricola, who died in 1557, and Paul Justin, who died in 1579. But other than that, those were the only two bishops he appointed after that. In fact, one scholar notes, when the long-serving Archbishop Laurentius Petri died in 1574, Justin was the last remaining consecrated bishop of the kingdom. In 1575, he was one of the consecrators of the new Archbishop of Uppsala, Laurentius Petri Gothus. However, his involvement came at the insistence not of the Archbishop or of the clergy, but of Johann III, the Catholicizing king. He wanted to win papal recognition for a real Swedish church as part of a conditional reconciliation with Rome. So that's Sweden, and how Sweden kept the episcopate. Germany was a very different story, though. Germany was not a single nation like Sweden was. It consisted of multiple independent states and cities. And some territories accepted the Reformation, others didn't. And few bishops accepted the Reformation, which made the perpetuation of the episcopacy nearly impossible. Now, there were German Lutheran bishops, but by 1587, the last German episcopate, the last Lutheran episcopate in the German territories was abolished. In Lutheran territories and in independent cities that had become Lutheran, the magistrate assumed the juridical functions of the bishops so that they functionally became the chief bishops of their territories. The magistrate selected superintendents who performed the functions of bishops. Consistories were founded to deal with the daily administration of the oversight of the church. Consistories consisted of generally a handful of clergy, a lawyer or two, and some sort of politician. This mixing, though, of the two kingdoms, of the secular and the ecclesiastical estates, it wasn't ideal by any means, but it was necessary at the beginning of the Reformation since so few bishops accepted the Reformation in the German territories. Unfortunately, Lutheranism in Germany was never able to shake itself free from the magistrate, and that system didn't come to an end until 1918, when the Weimar Republic was established. So as for the actual difference between Germany and Sweden regarding the episcopacy, I mean, functionally there's no difference. The German superintendents held the same office in essence as the Swedish bishop. They just had different forms of consecration and different titles. But the fragmentation of German Lutheranism along territorial lines, that really helps us understand the differences in worship as well. Not that there were great differences during the time of the Reformation and post-Reformation period, but the Swedish and many of the German rites were influenced by Luther's Latin and German masses. The Swedish Reformation is generally called more liturgically conservative, which is understandable when you consider that you had one archbishop rather than multiple territorial churches with their own church orders mandated by the magistrate of each territory. Lutherans in Sweden also didn't have the external influences like the Reformed and the Romanizing elements that Germany did during the Augsburg Interim. Lutheranism in Sweden, being much more politically consolidated, fared better when Romanizing or Calvinizing kings did ascend to the Swedish throne. So in spite of the differences in political situation and theological context, Lutheranism in Germany and Sweden during this time, they were the same Lutheranism. They were unified in their confession of faith. Lutherans confess, after all, that the gospel preached according to its pure intent and meaning and the administration of the sacraments in conformity with the Word of God, that's what is sufficient for true unity in the church. The differences between the German and Scandinavian Lutherans, even the differences in rights between the different German territories, didn't hinder the unity of their confession of the gospel at all. So that's, again, a very brief history and a very brief explanation of those two branches, two national branches, we should say, of Lutheranism. Thanks for the question. If anybody else out there has questions, and I know you do, shoot me an email, atpholycross@gmail.com, and I'll get to your question as soon as I'm able. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time on ATP.